He looked me straight in the eye and said without a trace of shame, "This house isn't yours anymore." In that moment, the walls where I had raised my children and spent a lifetime with my husband became nothing more than a stranger's property. I never imagined the betrayal would come from my own flesh and blood. And if you stay with me for just a while, I'll tell you how it all began. But before we start, I have one small request. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me so much to keep sharing my stories. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It warms my heart to know how far my voice can travel, even to places I've never been. The small town in Ohio where I was born has always carried the smell of wet earth after a summer storm, the kind that lingers in your lungs long after the rain has passed. Wooden porches creak under the weight of years, front yards bloom with wildflowers that grow without asking permission, and the air in the morning carries both the promise of work and the whisper of struggle. It was in this place, tucked away between cornfields and old oak trees, that I took my first steps into a world that demanded more of me than I could have ever imagined. I came into life in a family that knew poverty, but never lacked in love. My father worked the soil with hands cracked and rough, his back bent like the old fence posts that lined our property. My mother, always with her apron dusted with flour, turned simple ingredients into pies and jars of preserves she sold at the Saturday fair. We didn't have much no-polished silver or big houses, but we had something more enduring: the certainty that family was enough. By the time I was 15, my fingers had already grown calloused from the sewing needle. I worked as a seamstress for women in town, stitching hems, patching tears, and bringing new life to worn dresses. It wasn't much money, just a few dollars here and there, but it gave me pride. I remember standing in our kitchen, handing my mother those crumpled bills, and watching her smile as though I had brought her the world. That was the first time I realized how even the smallest efforts could ease the weight of another's burden. It was at 20 that I met Frank. He wasn't the sort of man who swept you off your feet with grand words or shiny shoes. He was a steady man, with broad shoulders from long hours at the lumber mill, dark hair always falling into his eyes, and a laugh that rose deep from his chest like the rumble of a train. He had a way of making you believe that no matter how little you had, life could still be good if you faced it together. We married young, with nothing but determination in our pockets and love in our hearts. We built our life one nail at a time, quite literally. The house we bought sat on a small patch of land at the edge of town, nothing more than 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that smelled of pine boards and fresh paint. But inside those walls, we created something bigger than space itself. We brought 3 children into the world: Peter, with his calm eyes and calculating mind; Anna, with her tender smile that could soften even the hardest of days; and Louis, our youngest, full of restless energy and a laugh that carried through the fields. I would have given my life for those children. Frank and I worked late into nights, he hauling timber, I sewing clothes until my fingers ached. Every dollar saved was poured back into the house, into groceries, into school supplies, into the hope that our kids would have more than we ever did. There were times we went without new shoes or skipped Sunday drives just to pay for their needs, but it never felt like sacrifice. It felt like love transformed into action. As the years stretched into decades, the seasons of life turned. The children grew tall, then left our little house for their own journeys. The walls of our home bore the scars of family life scratches from moving furniture, pencil marks tracking the kids' heights each year, photographs fading in frames. Frank's hair turned silver, and my hands grew slower, but still, we found joy in the quiet rhythm of age. We believed the hard part was behind us. We thought we had secured peace for our twilight years, but peace has a way of slipping quietly through the cracks when you least expect it. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon and the cicadas hummed their endless chorus, Peter came to visit. He sat at our kitchen table, dressed neatly in a pressed shirt, his eyes steady but distant. He spoke softly, the way someone does when trying to calm a restless horse. "Mom, Dad," he began, his voice measured, You need to think about the future. At your age, it's dangerous to keep everything in your own names. The world is full of scams, taxes, complications you don't need to deal with anymore. I can handle it for you. Let me put everything under my name. It's just paperwork. Nothing will change for you. You'll be safer that way. I felt the room grow heavier, as though his words had pulled the air right from it. Frank looked at him, silent but wary, his jaw tightening as though he sensed something underneath. I folded my hands on the table, my heart pressing against my ribs with an unease I couldn't name. It was the first time in my life that I questioned whether my own child's voice carried only love or something else hidden behind it. And that was the night Peter planted the seed. The idea that we should sign over everything we had ever built, everything we had ever sacrificed for, to him. Peter arrived one afternoon dressed in a crisp button-down shirt, sleeves neatly pressed, and shoes polished as though he were heading to a meeting at City Hall rather than to his parents' kitchen table. He carried a leather briefcase that looked far too formal for such a familiar setting, and when he opened it, the sound of papers shuffling filled the room like the rustling of dry leaves. His voice was calm, measured, each word chosen carefully, the tone of someone who had already rehearsed what he would say. He placed a stack of documents before us, the ink still fresh, the lines of text dense and difficult for our aging eyes to follow. "Mom, Dad," he began, his eyes steady. "This is only to help you avoid trouble with the government. You don't need to worry about taxes or paperwork anymore. I'll take care of everything. All you need to do is sign here and here." His finger tapped the margins, as though guiding children through a school assignment. I hesitated, staring at the long sentences filled with terms I couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. Frank furrowed his brow, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair. "Son, we've handled our bills all our lives," he muttered, suspicion creeping into his voice. But Peter smiled, that calm smile that had always softened us. "Dad, I know you have. But things are complicated now. Fraud, scams, endless forms. Let me carry this for you. I want your retirement to be free of worry." There was something reassuring in the rhythm of his words, as if the very sound of his voice could smooth the wrinkles of our doubt. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. I told myself this was trust, that a child who once played on our porch steps could never lead us astray. One by one, we signed the pages, the ink flowing quietly, almost ceremonially, as if sealing not just paperwork, but the course of our future. The changes came slowly at first, like shadows lengthening at dusk, too subtle to notice until night has fully fallen. Bills that had once arrived in our mailbox disappeared, replaced by Peter saying, "Don't worry, I've paid them already." Receipts that I used to tuck into a jar on the kitchen counter no longer reached my hands. He was efficient, almost overly so, stepping into roles we had managed for decades, as though he had always belonged there. Soon, it was not only bills. The checkbook, once resting in a drawer beside our telephone, went missing, and when I asked, Peter waved the question away. "I've got it now, Mom." "Easier that way," Frank grumbled under his breath, but didn't push further. My husband had always been a man of few words, but I could see the storm building in his eyes. I, on the other hand, swallowed my unease, convincing myself it was only a matter of modern life things shifting into younger hands. The months rolled on, the seasons changed, and with them came a growing uneasiness in our own home. Each time Peter visited, he seemed less like a son and more like a banker, briefcase in hand, ready to explain in patient tones why another signature was required. His explanations blurred together, something about accounts, liabilities, new regulations, until the words meant little more than the sound of rain tapping against a window pane. We nodded, trusted, signed. One bright morning, when the lilacs outside our window were just beginning to bloom, Frank suggested we walk down to the local bank. It had been our routine for years, withdraw a little cash, chat with the teller we'd known since she was a girl, then stop for coffee at the diner down the street. We dressed in our Sunday best out of habit, Frank in his old navy jacket, me with my hair pinned neatly, wanting to show respect to the institution that had guarded our savings for decades. Inside the bank, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of paper and ink. We approached the counter, where a young woman in a neat blouse greeted us with the professional smile of someone trained never to show surprise. Frank slid our passbook across the counter. "We'd like to make a withdrawal," he said, his voice steady. She typed into her computer, her fingers tapping quickly, the smile on her face faltering ever so slightly. Her eyes lifted, uncertain, then she excused herself and disappeared into a back office. Minutes stretched longer than they should, each second gnawing at the edges of my calm. When she returned, she was no longer alone. A man in a dark suit, tall and stern, accompanied her, his expression carrying none of the warmth we had expected. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson," he said formally, "I'm afraid there's an issue. This account is no longer under your names. It has been transferred to another holder." The words struck like a sudden gust of cold wind, sharp enough to steal the breath from my chest. I looked at Frank, his face frozen, the color draining away. My hands gripped the counter as though it could steady me against the ground shifting beneath my feet. I left the bank with my legs unsteady, as though the very pavement beneath me had turned to shifting sand. The world around me, the brick storefronts, the American flags fluttering from front porches, the chatter of neighbors across the street, suddenly seemed distant, muffled by the roar inside my ears. Frank walked beside me, silent, his hand clenched into a fist, his jaw tight, his eyes staring at a point far beyond what was visible. We didn't exchange words. Words at that moment seemed too fragile to hold the weight of what we had just heard. By the time we reached home, my heart ached with a heaviness I could not shake. I needed comfort, or at least clarity, and there was only one place left to turn. Anna. Our daughter had always been the gentle thread holding us together when storms threatened to tear the fabric of our family apart. With tears blurring my vision, I told Frank we had to go see her. He nodded without argument, as if he too knew that hope now rested in her hands. Anna lived just a few blocks away, in a modest 2-story house with white siding and flower boxes that spilled with petunias. She was in her mid-40s, her brown hair tied back in a loose bun, her apron still dusted with flour from baking. When she opened the door, her smile wavered as she caught sight of my red eyes and trembling mouth. "Mom, Dad," she whispered, ushering us in quickly, her voice tight with worry. We sat in her living room, the scent of cinnamon lingering in the air, the ticking clock on the mantel counting the seconds between each labored breath. My hands twisted in my lap as I tried to explain, stumbling over words that seemed too small for the fear clawing at my chest. Frank remained still beside me, staring at the floor, his silence louder than any protest. Anna listened without interrupting, her eyes filling as each word tumbled from my lips. When I finished, she pressed a hand to her mouth, as though trying to keep her composure from spilling into sobs. "Mom," she said finally, her voice breaking, "there's something you don't know." The room stilled. My heart stuttered. I leaned forward, searching her face for reassurance, but what I found instead was sorrow. Anna's eyes glistened, and she lowered them to her folded hands. "The house, the one you and Dad built, the one we grew up in, it isn't yours anymore. Peter already sold it." For a moment, the world tilted. My breath caught, sharp and shallow. "No," I whispered, my voice thin, brittle. "That can't be true." He wouldn't. But Anna reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled quickly, then turned the screen toward me. There, stamped in black and white, was the digital record of the sale. Our signatures were scrawled across the bottom, signatures I barely recognized as my own. The blood drained from my face. My hands shook so violently I had to press them against my knees to keep from collapsing altogether. I looked at Frank, whose lips pressed into a thin, pale line, his eyes glistening but refusing to release tears. The silence in the room grew unbearable, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I rose suddenly, the need to see with my own eyes overwhelming. "We have to go," I muttered, my voice strangled. "We have to go home now." Frank stood without question, his movements slow, heavy, as though carrying a weight he had long feared but never named. The walk back felt endless, each step carrying us closer to an answer I already dreaded. My chest tightened as our street came into view, the familiar row of maple trees casting shadows across the cracked sidewalks. And then I saw it. A sleek black sedan parked in front of our home, its presence foreign and unnerving. A man stood on the porch, his suit tailored, his hair neatly combed, his smile wide but impersonal. He looked to be in his early 50s, tall and imposing, with a briefcase at his side. As Frank and I approached, he extended his hand with the ease of someone conducting business, not offering kindness. "You must be the former owners," he said warmly, as though the words were meant to soothe rather than slice. "I'm the new owner of this property." Former owners. The phrase echoed inside me, relentless and cruel. My knees buckled, and Frank caught my arm just as the porch steps blurred in my vision. I wanted to scream, to protest, to claw the truth from the walls that had sheltered us for decades. But my voice failed me, lost to the hollow ache swelling in my chest. And then, from the corner of the porch, another figure emerged. Peter. He leaned casually against the railing, arms crossed, his face unreadable. He met my eyes with a calmness that chilled me to the bone. "It's true," he said evenly, his voice devoid of hesitation. "This house isn't yours anymore." The new place smelled of damp wood and peeling paint, the kind of odor that clings to your clothes no matter how often you wash them. It was a small rental on the outskirts of town, tucked between overgrown lots and rusted chain-link fences. The windows were drafty, their glass fogged with years of neglect, and the floor creaked under every step, like it was groaning at our presence. The bathroom sat almost outside, a cramped space with a rusted pipe that dripped endlessly, its water tasting faintly of iron. I tried to make it livable, setting a vase of wildflowers on the chipped kitchen counter, hanging our old curtains across the grimy windows, and scrubbing the stained floor until my knees ached. But no amount of effort could disguise the truth. This wasn't a home. It was a place to wait, a shelter from the rain, a roof barely holding itself up. The heart of our family had been ripped out with the loss of our house, and this new place only reminded us of what we no longer had. Frank, who once filled every room with his laughter, now sat for hours in silence. He would settle into the sagging armchair by the window, staring at nothing in particular, his eyes distant, like a man watching a train disappear down tracks he could never follow. The light that used to shine in him, the spark that carried us through hard times, dimmed a little more each day. I would catch him holding his head in his hands, shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his own body was too much to bear. Even meals lost their warmth. I would set a plate of cornbread and soup in front of him, foods he had always loved, but he barely touched them. His fork would rest on the edge of the plate, untouched, as he whispered that he wasn't hungry. Nights were colder too, not because of the drafty windows, but because of the silence. We once shared stories under the covers, laughing about small things, recalling old trips with the children, but now he would turn away, his breath heavy, his spirit locked in some private grief I could not reach. I tried to fill the void with small rituals. Each morning, I swept the front step even though no one visited. I watered the weeds that forced themselves through cracks in the yard as if they were flowers. I even placed our old family photos on the narrow mantel, though they looked strangely out of place against the faded, peeling wallpaper. I wanted to believe I could stitch our broken life back together like I once stitched torn dresses, but this fabric was too torn, too frayed. There were moments when I thought I saw glimpses of the man I knew. Once, when the radio played an old country tune we used to dance to, Frank's lips curved into the faintest smile, though it disappeared almost instantly. Another time, I caught him staring at a photo of our children as toddlers, his thumb brushing over Anna's small face as if remembering her laugh. But these were sparks in a night too long, too heavy to break. Days bled into weeks, and the silence grew thicker. The house became a mirror of his despair, each corner holding shadows that refused to move. I often sat across from him, begging him with my eyes to say something, anything, but he only shook his head slowly, as if words had abandoned him. There were times I wanted to shake him, to cry out and demand he come back to me, but instead I only sat quietly beside him, holding his hand, afraid that even my desperation might push him further away. The loneliness pressed down hardest at night. I would lie awake, listening to the faint hum of traffic from the highway, the distant barking of dogs, and the soft, steady breathing of Frank beside me. Sometimes in the darkness, I whispered prayers, though I didn't even know what I was asking for anymore. Strength, maybe, or just a moment of light to pierce through the gloom. My body ached, but my heart ached more, watching the man who once carried me through storms sink deeper into shadows I couldn't reach. Then came the morning that froze me in place. The sunlight filtered weakly through the dusty curtains, and I rose with my usual routine. Set the kettle, fold the blanket, prepare breakfast. But when I turned toward the bed, Frank was still lying there, his body unmoving, his gaze fixed not on me, not on the world, but on some distant place far beyond the ceiling. His eyes were open, but empty, and he made no move to rise. Anna was the one who finally pulled me from the fog of despair. She took my hand one afternoon, her eyes steady, though rimmed with tears, and said, "Mom, it's time. We can't let this go on." Her voice carried the kind of quiet strength I had once tried to instill in her as a child, and now she returned it to me when I needed it most. She led me down Main Street to a small brick office tucked between the post office and a diner, its painted sign reading, "Thomas Avery, Attorney at Law." Mr. Avery was in his early 60s, a man with thinning gray hair and rimmed glasses that slipped down the bridge of his nose. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches at the elbows, and his handshake was firm, grounding, like the clasp of someone who still believed in fairness. His office smelled of old paper and coffee, the walls lined with books that seemed to lean forward as if eager to help tell their stories. He listened quietly as I explained, my voice breaking, recounting every signature Peter had pressed upon us, every account we had lost, and finally, the house. Anna filled in the gaps when I faltered, her voice shaking with anger. Mr. Avery took notes on a yellow legal pad, his brow furrowed deeper with every detail. When I finished, I braced myself for disappointment, for him to tell me it was all too late. Instead, he set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and let out a heavy sigh. "Mrs. Johnson, what you've described is what we call abuse of trust. He took advantage of your faith in him as your son. It won't be easy, but this is something we can fight." His words, simple but firm, broke something inside me. Not despair, but the shell of fear that had kept me silent. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork and questions, trips to the county courthouse, and long evenings at Anna's kitchen table, where she held my hand as I practiced retelling our story for the record. Frank came with us when he could, though his voice was faint, his body weary. Still, when I saw him sit upright in that courthouse waiting room, his shoulders squared, I recognized the man I had married long ago, the man who had once built our house, nail by nail. The day of the hearing arrived with skies heavy and gray, the courthouse steps slick with rain. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of disinfectant. The courtroom itself was stark, its wooden benches worn smooth by decades of restless hands. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mr. Avery, my palms damp, my heart beating so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Frank sat just behind me, his presence a silent pillar of strength. Then Peter entered. He walked with the same calm stride I remembered from our kitchen table, wearing a tailored navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted. His expression was unreadable, his eyes flat, his mouth set in a line that suggested neither regret nor shame. When he glanced in our direction, it wasn't as a son acknowledging his parents, but as a man glancing at strangers across a room. My stomach turned cold. The judge, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that brooked no nonsense, called the session to order. Peter's attorney began with polished words, painting him as a dutiful son who had only wished to relieve his aging parents of financial burdens. I clenched my fists, the narrative so twisted it made me dizzy. When it was Mr. Avery's turn, he rose slowly, his glasses slipping as he looked toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "this case is not about efficiency or convenience. It is about trust. A trust so sacred that when it is broken, it leaves not only financial ruin, but deep scars in the human heart." He placed his hand on the stack of documents, the very ones Peter had given us to sign, their ink still betraying us even now. The judge turned to Peter, her eyes sharp. "Mr. Johnson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Peter stood, buttoning his jacket, his face composed. "I never meant harm," he said smoothly. "I was only trying to help manage what my parents could not. They didn't need the stress. I only wanted to protect them." His tone was so calm, so confident, that for a fleeting moment I feared the court might believe him. Mr. Avery adjusted his glasses, then took a slow step forward, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "If that is true, Mr. Johnson," he said, his gaze steady, "then perhaps you can explain this. Why did you sell their home without their knowledge?" The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock above the judge's bench. Papers rustled, a chair creaked, but all else seemed to pause as the weight of Mr. Avery's question lingered in the air. Peter's face remained composed, though a muscle in his jaw twitched, betraying what his words would not. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied him, waiting for an answer that never came. When the ruling was finally read, the words landed like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The contracts were null and void, the sale of the home invalid. Our house, our home, would be restored to us. I pressed my hands to my face, tears slipping through my fingers, while Frank bowed his head, shoulders trembling as though the burden of months had at last been lifted. Anna clutched my arm tightly, whispering, "It's over, Mom." "You got it back." Peter did not look at us. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked briskly toward the door without a single word of apology, his footsteps echoing across the tile until the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I knew in that instant that whatever bond of blood had once held us together had been severed. No verdict could stitch it back. The court had given us justice, but it could not restore what was lost between mother and son. The day we returned to our home, the sky was bright and the air smelled of freshly cut grass. As Frank and I stepped across the threshold, it felt like stepping into a memory that had been waiting for us. The walls bore the faint outlines where family pictures once hung, the floors still carried the scuffs of children's shoes long grown, and the kitchen window let in the same warm light I had stood in for decades. I placed my hand against the doorframe and whispered a silent greeting, as though the house itself had missed us. We unpacked slowly, carrying our few belongings from the small rental into the rooms that had once held so much. Anna helped us, her laughter ringing through the halls as she opened windows to let in fresh air, her children chasing each other across the yard. For the first time in months, life stirred again within those walls. It was not the same as before. Time and pain had changed us, but it was ours again, and that was enough. At first, Frank moved through the rooms as though he were afraid they might vanish. He touched the kitchen counter with tentative fingers, sat at the dining table in silence, and stood at the window where he had once watched the seasons turn. Slowly, the shadows that had clung to him began to lift. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of gold over the backyard, he turned to me with a faint smile. "We're home, Margaret," he said softly, and in his voice I heard the man I thought I had lost. Life took on a quieter rhythm. We planted tomatoes in the garden again, though only a small patch this time. I baked cornbread in the old cast-iron skillet, filling the house with the familiar scent of butter and warmth. Anna visited often, bringing groceries and stories, her presence a constant balm to the wounds we carried. There were moments of sorrow, still empty chairs at the table, the silence of Peter's absence, but we learn to live with them, to accept them as part of the fabric of our lives. Sometimes I would catch Frank humming to himself, a tune from years past, while he tinkered with the old radio in the garage. Other times, we sat together on the porch, watching neighbors walk by with their dogs, waving to us like nothing had ever changed. I realized then that peace did not mean forgetting. It meant finding a way to live with both the joy and the scars. Peter never came back. There were no phone calls, no letters, no second chances offered. I stopped waiting. A mother's love, though deep, cannot survive on memories alone. Instead, I poured that love into Anna and her family, into the grandchildren who ran across our yard and filled the air with laughter. The house once more held the sound of life, even if it was different from what I had once imagined. As I sit now in this old home, looking out the window at the garden we replanted, I know the truth of it all. We lost a son, yes, but we reclaimed our dignity, our shelter, and our right to live without fear. Justice was not swift, and it did not mend every wound, but it gave us back the one thing we had thought gone forever: peace. And sometimes, peace is enough. In the quiet after a storm, there is always a moment when the air feels different, lighter, but still carrying the memory of thunder. Stories like this remind us that life's deepest trials often arrive not from strangers, but from the very places we thought were safest. And yet, even in that breaking, we find that strength can return, that love can be rebuilt in quieter ways, and that peace, though fragile, can still be ours to hold. Sometimes it is not about reclaiming all that was lost, but about learning to breathe again, to sit with what remains, and to be grateful for the simple light that still finds its way through the cracks. These are the moments that show us who we are when everything else has been stripped away. Thank you for sharing this time with me. May your days be gentle, may your nights be restful, and may you always know the comfort of hearts that truly care. If this story touched you, I invite you to stay with us for more. Until then, take good care.